Okay.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to India Lab. India Lab is a webinar series to deepen and broaden discussions of India, key policy topics there, and to engage in dialogue across the world, really, the US, Europe, and India on matters of great concern. India Lab is based at the School of Public Policy at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst in the United States. We have the honor to host the Fullbright-Nehru Visiting Chair in Public Policy, Shanthie Mariet D'Souza. Dr. D'Souza has a long and distinguished CV, and I will give only some of the highlights. She's the founder and president of Mantraya, an independent research forum that seeks to make constructive contributions in the realm of strategy, innovations, and alternatives. She is also a visiting faculty at the Naval War College, Goa, a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., a research fellow at Welttrends Institute for Internationale Politik, Potsdam, an international advisor at the Nordic Counterterrorism Network, Helsinki, a member of the Board of Studies, School of International and Area Studies, Goa University, and more. As you can see, she is absolutely plugged in and an active member of several international communities. Her work here at UMass this year is on climate change, energy and human security, women, peace and security, countering terrorism, insurgencies and violent extremism, geopolitical trends in Asia, and more. I turn this event over to her now to introduce our distinguished speaker today.
Thank you, Professor Fountain, for that kind introduction and also for this opportunity to start the India Lab webinar series. And it's a privilege and honor to have with us today Dr. Sanjaya Baru, who is the founder trustee of the Forum of National Security Studies in India and a distinguished fellow at the United Service Institute of India and the Center of Air Power Studies in New Delhi, India. He's been an editor of major financial newspapers and was the media advisor to the former Prime Minister of India, that is Manmohan Singh, from 2004 to 9. He was also the director of Geo-economics and strategy at the International Institute of Strategic Studies, London, and Secretary General, Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry. Dr. Baru has been a member of India's National Security Advisor Board. He was the governing member of the Center for Policy Research and a visiting professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore and also at the Indian School of Public Policy, Delhi. He's been a professor of economics at the University of Hyderabad and has been a distinguished member of the India-ASEAN Eminent Persons Group in 2010. He has a wide range of publications and he has written extensively on geo-economics and foreign policy, and also on issues of climate change, energy, and transition. So it's an honor and privilege to have you, Dr. Baru, today to speak to us on fueling India's development, ESG, and the geopolitics of climate change. So we welcome you and would like to have your initial remarks in 20 to 25 minutes. We will be recording your talk, and after that, we switch off the recording during the Q&A. So I request all of you to keep yourself on mute as Dr. Baru gives his initial remarks. So over to you, Dr. Baru.
Thank you very much, Dr. D'Souza and Dr. Fontaine, and good morning to all your colleagues in Washington. Thank you for inviting me. I've known you, Dr. D'Souza, for many, many years, and therefore it's a particular pleasure to be here as your guest. The subject that has been given to me is energy insecurity and the geopolitics of energy, with a focus on issues raised more recently by the discussions on climate change. And I've decided to then focus more narrowly, after covering some of the larger policy issues, to look at a very specific issue of what has come to be called ESG, which is environment, social, and governance issues, which have become increasingly important to the domestic companies. and I'm requesting Justin to change the slides. I'm not very adept at this technology. So Justin, if you could move to the first slide. I think this slide captures two things. One, it captures, in some senses, the geopolitics and the geo-economics of India's energy dependence. And two, it also captures the entire dilemma of carbon emissions, climate change, environment policy. What it shows is the dominant role of coal in the supply of energy over the last 20 years. There's been a gradual increase of natural gas, but coal and oil dominate the almost 60% of India's energy needs. And over the years, biomass consumption has gone down as modern renewables have sought to replace biomass. And what is indicated in this chart as other includes, on the one hand, nuclear, which still accounts for less than 3% of our energy supply, but also hydroelectricity, which has been an important source of energy for India. And again, a source of supply that has come under a lot of pressure because of issues pertaining to ecology, biodiversity, displacement, and of course, overall, the challenge of climate change. This structure of demand should never be forgotten by anyone imagining a policy for energy in India. The geopolitics of India's energy consumption, the geo-economics of energy consumption, the economics of energy consumption, all of that is determined by this persistent structure in which oil and coal continue to dominate the sources of supply for as far as energy in India is concerned. And it is unlikely to change in the near future. So, any policy, any short-term to medium-term policy has to be based on an understanding of this structure of supply. Next chart. Now, as far as oil imports are concerned, and that brings us directly to the geopolitics of energy, India is dependent largely on what we call West Asia or Middle East, Iraq and Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates being the three dominant suppliers in that region. The United States has emerged as an important supplier over the last decade. For 10 years back, we hardly imported anything from the US, but over the last decade, we increasingly import oil from US. Nigeria was a traditional supplier, so was Kuwait, and so was Oman. Now, Russia figures very low in this list, but in the last 1 year, 1.5 years after the Ukraine war, India has increased sourcing of oil from Russia for a variety of reasons. We can get into that if there are questions. But Russia's rank would have gone up. This gives the average for the last several years. But in the last year and a half, Russia has emerged almost as one of the top suppliers of oil. Next slide, please. Now, given the structure of supply, for each source of supply, there are geo-economic and geopolitical challenges. Begin with coal. Coal has the biggest challenge, partly because of concerns about carbon emissions, climate change, global warming, all of which have become very, very important considerations for policymakers around the world, and nobody can ignore these challenges. And I will come probably a little later to the kind of geopolitical issues raised by coal. But I think one of the important consequences of the Ukraine war, and this is something that we in India have paid particular attention to, is the revival of coal in Europe. Germany has started using more coal. Britain has started using more coal. Many other European countries have started using more coal because they have stopped purchasing oil and gas from Russia. And I think it's a major policy question when going forward, whether the resumption of the use of coal by developed countries will ease the pressure on India or not. That's a policy issue going forward. But certainly, I think the post-Russian, post-Ukraine war situation has altered the economics of coal with a revival of mining, a revival of thermal power generation, particularly in Europe. As far as oil and gas is concerned, I mean, I'm sure it's a commonplace observation. All of you would be familiar. Geopolitics, in many ways, in the second half of the 20th century, was almost completely focused on access to oil and gas. The US and European presence in West Asia, the control of the sources of oil, of gas, the post-Cold War emergence of Russia and the pipelines across Central Asia and Eurasia. If you look at each one of the major business decisions with respect to oil and gas, there is nothing that is bereft of geopolitics. Those of us who are economists, we talk about pricing as a key issue in the consumption of oil and gas. But when it comes to the supply of oil and gas, pricing is a secondary issue. The primary issue is really about where you get it from, who supplies, who invests, who has control over the sources. And therefore, in that sense, geopolitics is very much central to the supply of oil and gas. Many of us in the developing world, particularly in Asia, because Asia's dependence on oil and gas Middle East has gone up. Today, in fact, more than 50% of the oil and gas from that region goes eastward towards China, Japan, Korea, India, Southeast Asia. Asia has become the major market, which was not the case 50 years ago, where Europe and the US were the major markets for Middle Eastern oil and gas. And there's therefore structural change in the market for oil and gas. And this structural change in the market for oil and gas has had huge geopolitical implications. But it has also had geo-economic implications in terms of, for example, pricing. I mean, pricing is something become a very sensitive matter. Every time there's a war in the region, as we now have in Israel and Gaza, prices shoot up. Of course, in the recent past, they've not shot up as much as they did in the past when you had the war in Iraq, the war in Iran, the war with Kuwait. Each of these conflicts has pushed the price up. So the geopolitics of the region has had a huge impact on our economies. Each time the price of oil goes up by $1, the real national income or real national GDP of a country like India goes down without any other activity, without any other, cause. There is a singular cause. Oil prices have contributed to a real loss of income over the last 40, 50 years. And therefore, India is particularly sensitive to the role of major powers in the Middle East and the impact of whatever they do on the price of oil and gas. Of course, this is not to deny the role of organizations like OPEC and other supply cartels. But apart from these price cartels, I think it's the geopolitics of the region and the security of the region which has had huge consequences for our economy. Then you come to nuclear, which is a new source of energy for India. And I don't know how many of you are familiar. This is one issue I was very closely engaged with when I worked at the Prime Minister's office when India and the United States signed on to the Civil Nuclear Energy Agreement in 2008. And the fact is that till we signed that agreement with the United States, we were not allowed to access nuclear fuel. We were not allowed to develop nuclear energy at home, given the fact that our domestic source of nuclear fuel are limited. We were not allowed to purchase nuclear technologies. So India's nuclear program was highly stunted. And despite the fact that we kept arguing that because of issues like climate change and our decision to reduce the dependence on hydrocarbons, we need to increase nuclear energy. We are not able to do that till we got the nuclear deal in place. And it's really the tremendous leadership of President George Bush and Prime Minister Manmohan Singh that we got the deal done. And there was a partial waiver from the nuclear suppliers group. I call it partial because India is not yet a member of the NSG. Now, our membership of the NSG, which is essential for us to be able to ensure access to nuclear fuel and technology and build our nuclear energy program, is being held back today by China. So while in the past it was the US which was coming in the way of our access to nuclear technology and fuel, today it's China which is doing that. And we remain, therefore, our nuclear energy program remains subdued. But there is no question that going forward, we have to increase nuclear energy, given the fact that we have to reduce our dependence on coal and we have to reduce our dependence on hydrocarbons. Finally, we come to renewables. I haven't mentioned hydroelectricity. Maybe I'll come back to it a little later. But coming to renewables, there is a big focus on renewables as part of our overall climate change policy. I believe the last lecture the previous lecture, which was the first lecture in this series, was given by my former colleague, Shyam Saran, who was India's envoy for the climate change talks. And I'm sure he would have covered a lot of the issues with respect to our commitments in promoting renewables in the context of climate change. But I think our real problem remains, even today, the need for technology transfer, and I'll come back to that in a minute, but also low-cost financing of that technology. Next slide, please. So if you look at India's evolving stance on climate change, we have moved from being defensive to becoming proactive. And I assume that those are the kind of issues that Shyam Saran would have covered last week on the transition or the change in our attitude. Not too far back, we used to talk about climate colonialism, climate imperialism, blaming the developed economies for all our problems. But I think now there's a change of language. We talk of climate justice towards a just transition from carbon fuels to renewables. But even climate justice requires, a continuation of differentiated kind of responsibilities, but also at the same time access to technology. One proactive decision that the Indian government took in 2014, and this is a major initiative that India took, was to be one of the founding members of the International Solar Alliance in 2015. And the International Solar Alliance has done quite a lot of initial spade work, and solar energy has emerged as a major renewable. I think there's one area in which India has a lot of success stories to talk about. Next slide, please. Very quickly, till now, whatever I have said, the focus has been on government policy, on international approach to some of these challenges. But the one issue which I would like to focus on in the kind of remaining time that we have is the way in which markets have entered this whole debate or the policy action in this area. Because till now, a lot of the climate-related policy issues related to reducing carbon emissions, issues relating to technology, etc., were discussed in plurilateral, multilateral conversations, in international conferences by government representatives. There was an attempt made in the World Trade Organization to link trade and investment to environment, but many of the developing countries continue to stall it and therefore not bring in some of these issues through the WTO link. But two things have happened in the last decade, which are of concern for companies in India. And my own past, I have been a business editor of business newspapers, and on boards of Indian companies. And I can tell you from my experience and knowledge of the concerns of Indian boards, that these are the two areas of particular concern for us, apart from the larger kind of macroeconomic issues. One is the product labeling, labor and green labeling that has become, very widespread. That we are unable to export products without securing what are called labor stamps and or labor labeling and green labeling. Now, labor labeling has been easier to deal with because, at least in law, India addresses all these challenges. Though the Indian view has been that the International Labour Organization is the right organization for these issues to be addressed. But nevertheless, since firms around the world are demanding labor labeling, for example, in garments exports, you need to have a labor label. And many firms are addressing this. There is a fairly significant reduction, for example, in the use of child labor, which was a major issue even till about 2 decades back in India, and fair wage, etc. But green labeling is the new thing, and green labeling has been brought through what is referred to as the ESG rating, which is done by international investment organizations. And ESG rating has had an impact on investment because companies today are no longer able to access finance without securing ESG rating. Next slide, please. Now, what are ESG ratings? An ESG rating measures a company's exposure to long-term environmental, social, and governance risks. Morgan Stanley Capital International is the kind of accepted ESG rating used globally. It aims to measure a company's management and financially relevant ESG risks and opportunities. And key environmental issues fall under the categories of climate change, natural capital, pollution and waste, and environmental opportunities, which firms need to address. Next slide, please. Now, at the firm level, the ESG rating focuses on about 8 issues. The climate change issues are firm level carbon emissions, then you have firm level product carbon footprint, firm level financing of the environmental impact of whatever it's doing, the firm level climate change vulnerability. All these have to be measured by firms. Then there are natural capital issues like at firm level, water sourcing, quality of water, source of water, recycling of water, biodiversity and land use, impact on biodiversity of land use, and raw material sourcing. Each of these items have to be monitored at the firm level. And this is a new responsibility that listed firms in India are now required to address. Next slide. And the ESG ratings by Morgan Stanley is based on 6 parameters that are tracked: toxic emissions and waste, packaging material and waste, electronic waste, clean technology, green building, and renewable energy. And to track each of these, now firms have in place responsible management, what I would call ESG office with trained manpower, qualified manpower to collect the data at factory level data, and these are presented at the board level. Since I'm a member of company boards, I can tell you these data are presented to boards. We look at the data, and these are certified now by certified organizations. Next slide. In India, the institution that monitors all this is the Securities and Exchange Board of India, which has what is called a Business Responsibility and Sustainability Report. And that report tracks the greenhouse gas footprints of a firm, water footprint, energy footprint, total energy consumption, and percentage of energy from renewable sources. It looks at embracing circularity, details related to waste treatment, waste management, um, the well-being of workers, of employees, data on any impact that um, technology might have had, or um, you know use of chemicals, use of raw materials, use of machinery may have had on the health of employees. Gender diversity and the inclusive nature of development are also brought in, which are not directly related to climate change or environment, but nevertheless are factors that are monitored. And finally, of course, fairness in engaging with customers and so on. So the reason I put all this in front of you is to say that the issues of climate change are not about governments sitting together and having these major international agreements and making commitments at the national level. It's not about sequencing the transitioning out of different forms of energy use. It's about cost to firms. At the end of the day, it impacts individual firms and it impacts their competitiveness. And I think, is this the last slide or do I have? Yeah, this is the last slide. So let me, I think I've coming to the end of my 20 minutes. So let me say a little about the kind of issues that firms are dealing with. Because as I said, at the end of the day, each of these larger public policy issues, when we talk about climate change, talk about carbon emissions, about global warming, about water scarcity, firms are paying a huge price for being not just dealing with these challenges. I mean, of course, you have to pay a price for dealing with the challenge. If you are emitting carbon, you need to reduce that. That is something firms have to do. But right now, the cost is in simple monitoring of all of this, gathering data, processing the data, and maintaining that data. And that is creating challenges. So when this whole ESG issue come up in the last year, you will see if you Google and look at government officials in the current government of India, several senior officials have been raising questions about not just the relevance of these measures, but the timetable for the implementation of these measures. I think finally, in the debate on transition, on energy transition, the issue no longer is about whether we should, ensure it or not. I don't think that's the issue any longer. That was certainly the issue 10, 20 years back, and I'm sure it's an issue with many people in many countries, including the United States. People who don't believe there's a problem, right? If you don't believe there's a problem, there's no need to deal with the problem. So recognizing the problem is part of the game. I think the real issue today is once you recognize the problem, deciding on a timetable for dealing with that problem, and a timetable that is relevant to already industrialized economies and that is relevant to developing economies. And that is at the core of the international geopolitics today. I mean, the whole geopolitics or geo-economics of climate change, global warming, energy transition is about what is the pace at which change will be done. I mean, what is the pace at which we accept, we in the developing economies, developing world will accept, undertaking these responsibilities, and the developed economies accept undertaking the responsibilities. In some ways, it's the same issue that has stalled the multilateral negotiations in WTO, because WTO began with what was called special and differential treatment, SDT, and in climate change, we talk about differentiated responsibilities, common but differentiated responsibilities. Now, CBD, common but differentiated responsibility, CDR, is no different from SDT in WTO. And the whole dialogue between developed countries and developing countries is about the timetable. I mean, as I said, there are people still, I know countries and leaders who don't believe in all of this stuff, who think climate change is a myth, is a fantasy. But even those who believe in it, I think the real issue is what is the timetable that we want to lay out in front of us. So, and that's not going away. I mean, I think that is where, when phrases like climate imperialism are being used, and you can come across such phrases in the public discourse, I think the real issue is about this common but differentiated responsibility between developed and developing countries. Let me stop there. I've done my 25 minutes, and I'll be very happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Baru. And it was a very interesting and fascinating presentation, which I think you have very nicely captured in the sense of putting things in perspective, given the fact that you actually make this point that it's not just the